Muy bien, entonces vamos a comenzar con Francois Ross, con The Discourse Functions of Mojeño Trinitario, Classifiers in Verbs.
Discúlpeme, yo tengo un problema de internet, volví después de François y yo hablo.
Claro, Bruna, ¿está bien así?
Bueno, a ver.
Bruna,
¿podrías
hacerlo después de François. Da lo mismo, estamos a punto de empezar. Cualquiera de
Está bien, después de François.
Perfecto. Listo. Adelante, François. François, ¿no te escucha? Tu micrófono está apagado. Ahora.
Sí, ¿ahora me escuchan?
Perfecto.
Y a ver, ¿pueden ver el diaporama?
Sí.
Bien. So today we'll talk about the discourse functions of Mojeño Trinitario classifiers in verbs. Mojeño Trinitario is an Arawak language of lowland Bolivia, for which there is now an extensive linguistic description and also a collection of texts online. For this study, I've looked at about 8 hours of recordings, but I've also done some counts of classifiers in a text sample, totalizing about 175 tokens of classifiers. Very briefly, there are 31 classifier suffixes in this language. It is only one set of classifiers that distributes over numerals, adjectives, nouns, and verbs, building what Eichenwald calls a multiple classifier system. Today, I will talk specifically about the use of classifiers on verbs. That is to say, in a way, verbal classifiers. So they are found on verbs, but they categorize a nominal element. And the element that they categorize is not really the noun by itself, but the reference. So if you look at examples 1 and 2, the noun phrase to kuhi, the tree, is categorized in the same verb tito, to be bare, it is bare, in two different ways. Once first with the classifier for cylindrical elements, and in example 2 with the spherical classifiers. So you can see that the same noun can be assigned to various classes, and the classifiers highlight some inherent or temporary property of the referent. Here, they are used to put the focus on some part of the tree, the trunk or the crown. Very briefly again, in terms of forms of classifiers and syntactic distribution, the main difference with nouns is that classifiers cannot stand as the head of an NP, so they are not free elements. Most of them have a CV structure, as you can see in the selection that I've put on the right, and they have very general semantics in terms of physical properties like shape. Now about classifiers on verbs, more specifically, what is interesting in this language is that the participant that is associated with the classifier can be, as is common cross-linguistically, the subject of intransitive verbs or the object of transitive verbs, but in about a fourth of the cases, it also associates with an oblique participant, which is more rarely described, even though I think it is not that rare, at least in the Amazonian context. And there's another specificity of these classifiers on verbs in Mojeño, which I won't talk about today, but I've published a paper on that in linguistic typology. These classifiers associating with obliques can actually have an applicative function, and in that case, the oblique participant is actually encoded as a core argument. And a little last information on these classifiers on verbs is that the human classifier, more specifically, is not found on active verbs. One last piece of general information on the language. There's another nominal categorization system in the language that is found in person formatives like articles and pronouns, that is encoding humanness, number, gender, and gender of the speaker. This gender marking and the classifiers do interact, but it's not very crucial for today's talk. So I want to jump into the main topic, the thing that I want to discuss in detail today, the functions of verbal classifiers, and mainly actually their discourse functions. So why this question? Well, first of all, classifiers are not obligatory in this language except on numerals, and they are found in more than a third of the sentences in the sample. So it is something that is in need of explanation. Why focus on their distribution on verbs? First of all, because half of the occurrences of classifiers are found on verbs in the sample. So that's actually their main context of occurrence. And I think it's also a little bit less discussed in the literature. Now, about the functions of classifiers in general, I really like the paper by Alex François stating that categorization or classification is not their primary function. And he draws this interesting parallel with articles in Romance languages that do encode gender and number, but it's not their primary function. Their primary function is to indicate, in this case, definiteness or indefiniteness. I will also base my presentation on the paper by Contini, Murava, and Kilarskis on the functions of classifiers, where they distinguish two blocks of functions. First, the semantic functions, on which I am actually publishing a paper with Anne van Linden, where they distinguish derivation, which is actually common in South America, but represents only 4% of the classifiers on verbs in my sample, so I won't discuss it. Differentiating, reference, and ascribing properties, which I call qualification, and individuation, which is not really done by classifiers in Mojeño, but rather through the use of determiners. And then the second block is the one I'm interested in today, the discourse functions, and they distinguish reference management, referent identification, and representation of reference. I think it is an important topic. As Doris Payne put it, the primary function of a noun classification system may be related to discourse level participant reference, but up to now, there's been rather little investigation of these discourse issues. And I've been very glad today to watch some of the talk of this session that are asynchronous, that we're actually dealing with discourse functions, like that by Stephanie and Rosa, and also the one by Lady. Okay, so let's jump and look at the first block of functions that they call reference management. Basically, this is how are classifiers used in the management of reference in terms of definiteness, persistence, or prominence in discourse. To do this, we will look at reference management functions of verbal classifiers, both with an associated noun, be it subject, object, or oblique, it doesn't matter, or without an associated noun with the same functions. And for this, I've done counts of referential distance and topic persistence à la Given on 3 types of referential expressions: nouns, the associated use of classifier and noun, so classifier in the verb with its associated noun, and classifier on the verb without an associated noun. So the first results are about referential distance. So let me recall you that referential distance is the a computation of the number of clauses to the left of the referential expression to the previous occurrence of the referent that is overtly marked. And when you look at the numbers, either the average or the median, you can see that the classifiers are used more often than nouns for participants that are given. Let me recall you that this figure 20 for the median referential distance is the number that is arbitrarily given to nouns, to referential expressions that do not have a previous occurrence in the text. So it means basically that they are new. Most of them are new. So classifiers are used more often than nouns for participants that are given, and they are used more often alone without an associated noun when participants have been mentioned more recently. So I think it's really an important result. Now for topic persistence, it is the number of clauses to the right in which the participant continues an uninterrupted presence as a semantic argument of the clause, marked overtly or not. And I think the number is actually quite comparable for the three constructions. So it's not really that the degree of topicality is not relevant, as you will see soon, but it's not really showing in the figures. So now I will look in detail at the reference management function of verbal classifiers, first with an associated NP. And there are two major functions. The first function is the first mention of a participant. So example 3 is taken from a text by a traditional healer telling his the first time he actually cured someone. And so he's been talking about this woman that he has healed, but the stomach is actually here the first mention. This sentence is the first mention of the stomach, and you can see that it is encoded by a noun phrase, determiner and noun, and a classifier in the verb. These classifiers with an associated noun can also be used for a new mention of an old participant, and you see that in example 4, where Tosanti, the field, is also categorized in the verb with this co-classifier for path, which is actually a bounded space, basically with parallel boundaries. This sentence is extracted from a text that is fully devoted to explaining how to make a field. So the field has been constantly referred to in the text. So it is not a new participant, but here it's a new mention of an old participant after a few sentences without any mention of it. Okay, so that was for classifiers with the associated NP. And now the functions of verbal classifiers without an associated NP. And these functions are actually different. So first, there is the introduction of a new non-topical participant that you can see in 5, where the classifier for atmospheric element refers to basically the sky, the weather, the environment in general. And you can guess that this subordinate clause is really a parenthesis in the text. The whole text is not about the atmosphere, and actually it's not referred to later in the text, so it's non-topical. And then in 6, you can see a very basic example of anaphora, that is to say mention of a given participant. And this anaphora, this anaphoric use of the classifier he on the verb for amorphous element refers back to tomuihi, the noun phrase that is present in the preceding clause. So it's not super old. It's something that we've been talking about. Okay, that's it for reference management. Then we can jump on to referent identification, answering the question of when the associated noun is not expressed within the same sentence, how does the classifier help identifying the referent? Okay. This is a very, very important question because in the text sample, 80% of the classifiers on the verbs are found without an associated noun. So it's a very, very common use. And then the classifier participates in referent retrieval by 4 manners: inference on the situation within the discourse, inference on the speech event, interpretation as a kind or as a prototype, and disambiguation between potential reference. So we'll go through all of them. So first of all, a first way of identifying the referent is inference on the discourse situation. There are straightforward cases of anaphora, like we've seen with the straw before. Here is another example where there is a first clause with it's a non-predicative, non-verbal predication with the ara noun phrase that is referred again in the following clause with the classifier for round things with a peak or beak, that is to say fruits and birds. And interestingly, you can see that it can still be used in further clauses like the next sentence again and again to refer back to this same referent. So that's a very straightforward case of anaphora. But there are cases where the classifier is used without an overt antecedent. And then we have to infer the identity of the referent. And we can infer it from the discourse situation. So example 8 was taken out of a text telling a trip in the forest. And then there's this sentence, it is waiting for us, coup. So this bounded space. And this bounded space in this context of the forest and waiting for someone is automatically interpreted as referring to the path.
You have
All
5
right.
minutes.
Yes. The inference can also be done through metonymy, which is bridging or indirect metaphora. So in this example taken from the frog story, the subject is actually the dog. It is a transitive verb, but it's detransitivized by the middle marker. And there is actually no noun phrase expressing the head. It is inferred from the use of the classifier for sphere. Because it is an intransitive verb and there's a reference to sphere, it has to refer to the head of the dog. And that's completely obvious to any speaker. Finally, a second way of identifying the referent is by exophoric retrieval. So it's simply locating the referent deictically in the context of the speech event. And there's a very simple example where pue, the ground here, refers to the ground surrounding the speaker. Then the third way of identifying a referent is to interpret the classifier as a kind or as a prototype. So in example 11, the use of the classifier A for liquid is kind of vague. It obviously refers to a body of liquid that can be crossed. So it could be a river, a lake, or if we were not in Bolivia, the sea. It can obviously not refer to a jar of beer or to maternal milk, but it's still vague. And actually, we will only learn in the next sentence that we deal with a lake, but it's not super important for the story anyway. And then this is also very visible in the translation task of classifiers. Speakers usually provide 1 or 2 prototypical members of the class, depending on the lexical verb, even though there's no noun phrase in the sentence. So for example, with this coup classifier for a bounded space, depending on the verb, you get very different prototypical member. But it's a very automatic identification, and there's never a speaker that says, oh, I don't know what they're talking about. They always offer some prototypical member. And finally, there's a use for disambiguation. It was kind of hard to find a nice example, and it's probably not perfect. We are in a text where the rooster searches for the cricket into some corn husks. And then we come to this clause, until he succeeded and gulp, swallowed it. But there's no real it. There's no personal suffix for that. The only indication of this it is the classifier for sphere that can also refer to insects. So here we know that what has been swallowed is an insect, and for example, not a corn husk. All right. Then to finish, the third function, discourse function of classifiers is representation of reference. That is to say, how are classifiers used in giving different representations of the same referent? So I've told you before that the same referent may be categorized differently, and it can actually be recategorized within the discourse, mainly for two different functions, either when the physical properties evolve through time, or when the speaker adopts a different perspective on the reference. So first, this transformation of the reference. So here we have two classifiers. Let's start with the iota, the he amorphous classifier in the verb. And there's the homo classifier on the noun for tobacco. And actually, these two classifiers both refer to tobacco, but one to juice and the other one to the leaves that are being tuned to make juice, basically. So we have two different classifiers referring to two different forms of tobacco. And then the perspective shift is illustrated in this final example where the dogs, Marni Tatahono, are classified in the first clause with the fabric classifier for basically thin, flexible things, meaning here that these dogs are just lying on the ground, not doing anything. And in the final sentence of this extract, you can see the classifier mu for group, which shows that here the dogs are seen as a group of entities. And it's much more interesting because then they could go and hunt, which is more useful for human beings. All right, so a very, very brief one-slide summary. So the classifiers on verbs are not used for agreement. It is not an agreement system because they are not obligatory. They are selected by the speaker and they're actually used for discourse management. And beyond the three different types of discourse functions that we've seen, I would like to draw some generalizations. The discourse functions of classifiers are most salient on verbs. And their derivational function is not really important, though it's useful. And also something that I haven't really been able to discuss, but the discourse function and the semantic functions can be done simultaneously. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Françoise. So now we have about 9 minutes for questions. We invite the participants to write the questions in the chat or voice their questions directly.
Ellie has a question. Please, Ellie.
Hi, thank you. It was a very nice paper. And I just have a question about when you said at the end that the classifiers are most salient on verbs. Is that related to the agreement hierarchy in some way? In other words, that
no, sorry, I think you've understood me wrongly. I was thinking of the discourse functions. So there's when I worked on the semantic functions of classifiers, like derivation and what I call qualification, so ascribing properties and adding qualification to the referent. This is more easy to illustrate with nouns on classifiers on nouns or numerals or adjectives. While on verbs, the discourse function for me is now that I've done the work, very obvious and very salient. While if you have a classifier on a noun, it doesn't really change the fact whether it's topic or definite or things like that, in that language, at least. That's what I meant.
Thank you. Spike?
Morning. Nice talk. I'm curious, this feels a bit like what I've heard described as optional agreement, in the sense that, tends to show up but not require, but tends to show up with definite things. And you said in 80% there's no noun. I'm wondering if you have a sense of to what extent the verbal use correlates with givenness, or with, because you said you showed examples of how it how do I put this? It's the combination of those things that are topical and continuing topics, so they're fully accessible, and those things that are so non-topical that you won't bother to give them a noun, you just allude to them. Does that intersection of those two sets account for pretty much all of the uses?
Yes, yes, I would say so. I mean, you're talking about the uses of classifiers without an associated noun, right?
Well, or I guess I'm wondering if it's something different when there is an associated noun, because that's still 20% of your examples. Those?
So when there is an associated noun, it's either for introduction of a new participant or for the mention of an old participant.
And on those, is there a sense of whether their topic worthiness? Will they like continue to be a topic if they're introduced with a noun and a classifier? Is that sort of give a clue?
That's why I've been calculating this topic persistence thing that for me is not super telling, but I think it's kind of normal, because so remember, the classifier without an associated noun is both for non-topical participant and for anaphora, basically. So these two, in terms of topicality, don't fit together so that they don't give a nice result with this topic persistence figure. I think that's what actually kind of blurs the picture, and that's why the topic persistence count is not interesting, because they are two very different functions in terms of topicality.
But what about when they come with an associated noun?
So when they come
just
with
a
an
subset of classifier plus noun, would that have a different topic persistence profile from the classifier without an accompanying noun?
The figures were almost similar. I'm not, well, maybe one problem is that I'm not super familiar with this type of counts. And if the other, the referential distance gives higher figures, so the distinction is more easy to see. Maybe I should do some statistical analysis to check whether that's actually, the figures are telling, because they are between 0 and 1.5. So it's not super easy to see the difference between three figures. I don't know if you think that would be worth it, but for me, it wasn't telling, precisely because when the classifiers on the verbs are used without an associated noun, they can be either for non-topical or, on the contrary, very topical participants.
Thank you.
Johnny?
Thank you so much for your excellent speech, Françoise.
Thanks,
my question is about the obliques.
Uh-huh.
This behavior described by you is really rare and very interesting.
Uh-huh.
Would it not be evidence of a more central role of this type of constituent as subject and object in this language?
You mean the obliques?
Yes.
I don't think they really have anything special. So I tried to avoid as much as I could this kind of examples, not to complexify, but there was one clear example, the one that is waiting for us on the path. So waiting is a transitive verb. The subject is e, the object is us. And then there was these classifiers, meaning on the path. And you could actually easily add an oblique sentence with a preposition on the path, and that's very fine. So you have the noun phrase with its preposition and the classifier on the verb. You can also do away with the noun phrase. And then in some examples, you have the classifier for this oblique participant, and then the oblique is actually loses its preposition, basically, is now a core argument, and you get finally in the end something that really looks like an applicative construction. By reading grammars around the area, it seems to me that it's probably not that uncommon that classifiers on verbs refer to something else than the subject and the object. It is so much repeated in the literature that it has an absolutive pattern that I'm not sure that we linguists often think of looking at something else, especially because, I don't know, for me, this interpretation of classifiers is very obvious. And so if you don't really look for what is the exact referent and what role it has in the sentence, maybe you just won't notice it. But I've seen at least some descriptions asserting that classifiers on verbs associate with some oblique participants. And I think they're very normal oblique in that language.
Merci beaucoup, Frances.
Thank you, Frances. We are about to run out of time, so we may have time for one quick question and quick response. Go ahead, Lena.
Yeah, thanks, Françoise, for the talk. I've been working on the Paunaka language, which is quite very much related, and the situation is very similar, only that classifiers are much less used in Paunaka, but we find the same functions. And so my question to you is, if they have an oblique function on verbs, do they ever have a function that is different from locative? Do you find instruments?
It's mostly locative. Let's say spatial. So it can be locative, but it could also be ablative or the goal of the, depending on the meaning of the verb, actually. So it would be interesting to look at that into more detail. Most of the time it's locative, but sometimes it's ablative and goal. And I think I've found one example where it's some other type of obliques. Now I don't have it in my mind. Mainly locative. I guess it's also the major type of oblique, especially because remember that the human classifier is not found on active verbs, so it couldn't be for a commutative participant, for example, because it is not found, this human classifier.
Okay, thank you.
I see that we run out of time.
Yeah, there are a few other questions.
If you have more questions, just send them.
Take a look at the chat, Francois.
Okay.
There are a few there. Thank
Thanks,
you so
everyone.
much.